other rescue operations. The other rescue operations included children and adults. Kinder transport was just for children. Let me go to the next one. It's created by the British government. It waived all visa requirements for children, kinder transport. The children being rescued were between the ages of 5 and 17. Some were younger, but I think mostly it was 5 and up. Around 10,000 children were saved through the kinder transport efforts. They mostly came from Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia, but they also came from Poland and the free city of Danzig. I think we talked about that. Okay. The kinder, or the kids involved in the kinder transport. The transports from Austria started in late 1939. It started in 1938. Mostly, I forget exactly when Kristallnacht was, but
It was
when
1938.
it was 1938. So around the time that Kristallnacht started and the really intense persecution started, kinder were transported out of Austria. Most of them were Jewish. When the Austrian children came to Britain and were settled in foster families, they were often discriminated against or prejudiced because of their country of origin. Because Austria was basically aligned with Germany, even though it had been taken over. So compared to the Poles and the Czechs, they were treated pretty badly. All male children above a certain age, including Jews, were considered enemy aliens, especially because they were from Austria. Some were even deported back to their country that they had been escaping. Most of them were put in hostels in Britain, which is basically like a hotel, I guess, you work. Usually the Jewish children were the only surviving family members of the Holocaust. Very rarely were the whole family brought together at the end of the war. After the war, many Austrian children who had lost their family stayed in the UK or immigrated to the United States or Australia. Many felt betrayed by their countrymen who had supported the Nazis during the Anschluss, so much did not want to be known as Austrian and thus did not return to Austria.
Andrew, where's the USB?
The main reason Austrian children left for Great Britain with the kinder transport was because of the German persecution they faced after the Anschluss and Kristallnacht. The children in the kinder transport program who came from Austria were put into foster families in Great Britain. While the younger children were put with families, the teenagers were usually put in hostels till the end of the war. Again, this is mostly the male children above 15. In his testimony, Stephen, he was a Jewish child that escaped from Austria. He tells how his family escaped Austria and German persecution after the Anschluss. Stephen was about 6 years old at the time of their escape. He remembers one incident in which his father comes home and told his wife that he had been shot at by police just for being a Jew. And there are many other small instances like this that make them want to leave Austria. They eventually escaped to the United States, but not before going through Spain and India. His immediate family were finally reunited in May 1943 in Massachusetts. His extended family was spread all across the globe, including Palestine, Dominican Republic, Switzerland, England. So basically, they had nowhere really to go in Europe because of the German invasion. The main method to leave Austria was by train to Germany, and then a boat to Britain. Because they were part of the kinder transport project, it's not like they could be pulled off the train and put in a ghetto or something, so they were safe.
So this is Austria, and then they went through, and they would usually congregate in Vienna,
Yeah.
and actually even the German transports would congregate in Vienna. And they took this route, and this is Holland, so they went around the Nook of Holland and across the Channel to Britain. So this is the German Jewish Children's Aid, and this was an American effort to rescue Jewish children from Germany specifically. Some other countries were included, but it was mainly from Germany. So all the children came unaccompanied, and parents were forced to stay behind in Germany or Austria, or they'd already been murdered. 1,400 children were rescued in total. German Jewish Children's Association was a group that was a bunch of different smaller groups. So there were small organizations that contributed, but that's the total that came to America through this. So it's an American-based organization they were in New York, and it was later renamed the European Jewish Children's Aid. It was formed in New York in 1934 by a coalition. In 1938, the National Council of Jewish Women took over the project. Also, there was the New York Foundation was involved, and the Baron de Hirsch Fund and other Jewish associations in America contributed. Mainly financially, there were a couple individuals that I'm going to talk about that helped physically to rescue them, but these people funded them. And the children came directly to the United States from 1934 through the end of the war. The first group was just 6 kids who came in 1934 in November. And this and subsequent small groups totaled about 100 children annually in the following years. And they were taken to foster homes that were arranged through requests to religious congregations or people who were part of these Jewish associations. So before 1941, only small groups were brought to the U.S. because of social hostility that did not allow all these Jewish families, mainly, who were requesting to come to America. They had strong immigration policies against it, and so that's why there were such small groups that were able to come, and only children when these efforts started. So sponsoring organizations wanted to avoid drawing undue attention to the children whose immigration was limited by quotas for their countries of origin, the United States immigration quotas. So in 1939, the proposed bill to admit 20,000 Jewish refugees under the age of 14 to the United States from Nazi Germany failed to get congressional approval. And later from 1941 to 1942, larger groups of OTC, this is referring to the 1,000 children, 1,400, the rough a number in this that were brought over by this effort. They were organized and arrived in the USA but only, like Emma said, when news of the atrocities that were happening in Germany were more widely circulated. So children were granted visas and they were given foster homes, but they were not allowed to be adopted, and the organizations who funded their transportation to the U.S. actually paid bonds per child to the U.S. government, and they were not allowed to stay in orphanages, and they just had to stay in private homes. The foster families in the U.S. had to agree for the children to take care of them until they were 21 and see that they were educated, and they didn't want them to be a burden on society, and so they had to make sure that they were educated and able to resume their lives if they were reunited with their families. Most of the children were assigned a social worker from a local social service agency to oversee the resettlement process. The children were generally placed in Jewish homes. These children and their sponsors expected that they would be reunited with their families, but there was very few people who were, as the families who remained in Europe were often sent to concentration camps. Most of the children lost one or both parents and most of their extended families by the end of the war. In 1943, a new visa application form was very extensive, and it was used specifically for these efforts with details that required things of the refugee and the 2 sponsors. And 6 copies had to be submitted. So there was a very long process, and obviously the U.S. government was against this strongly, but the German Jewish Children's Aid fought and tried to bring as many as they could. So it took about 9 months for applicants to be able to come, even if they were in like really dire situations, and oftentimes applications would be refused just because people had left, Germany or Austria or Poland where the hostility was happening, and they would go to Spain or Portugal or North Africa, and they wanted to come to the U.S., but they were denied. And many of these children had fled from other parts of Europe and smuggled over the Pyrenees. Okay, so this is important contributors. Cecilia Razowski was the secretary of the Jewish Children, German Jewish
Children's Association.
Children's Association. I totally forgot what this stands for a time, and she was the secretary. She was a writer and reformer of immigration policy, which allowed for the rescue efforts to happen. So she actually, I was reading about her, I was reading somewhere else, and they were like, she's really important, so I looked it up, and she was just a writer. And I was like, well, what did she actually do? But she did publish some pamphlets, and there were people in Congress who read them, and it changed policy, because there was like a really big fee that you had to apply to get a visa, and through her writing about immigration problems and the dire need of all these people to come, they waived that for a lot of people and allowed them to come. And so this is a quote from her, and she said, "I feel like I'm fighting our entire governmental structure. I am appalled by the anti-Semitic rubbish of Father Coughlin and others. How can Roosevelt and his advisors fear that a few children, Jewish children, will ruin the New Deal, take food out of the mouths of others, and be a burden on our society? All this happens as I know that every day more and more are sent to concentration camps and death. I cannot take even one moment to rest." And then another person who was very involved in the rescue operations, her name is Kate Rosenheim. And in 1934, she started working for the Department of Children's Immigration in Germany, and often accompanied children to safer countries, so like the U.S. and England. So she would take trips with them and make sure that they were settled well, but she always came back to help another group of people, and she returned to the hostile Germany even though she was a woman and she was Jewish herself. It was very dangerous, and she kept helping people escape the growing anti-Semitism and hatred. In 1936, she traveled to the U.S. to make sure that the rescued children were being well cared for, and that year, 161 boys and 76 girls were able to leave Germany for the U.S., thanks to the Reich representation of Jews in Germany and German Jewish Children's Aid, which was located in New York City. She eventually got to safety in America via Cuba with her family in, I think, 1938. But she did help as much as she could until they were safe. I don't know what the deal with the fonts is, but survivors. So these are just a couple of the people from these operations who were rescued. And so they contributed largely to American society. So these are examples. One of the children, Jack Steinberger, became a Nobel laureate in physics. Another became an ambassador and was the first of the Ritchie boys during and after World War II, and then had a very significant diplomatic and legal career, and most importantly was the U.S. Ambassador of Human Relations for the UN. And then Gunther Stern was one of the Ritchie boys and had a distinguished career as a university professor and Holocaust Museum director. And Bill Graham was a promoter of the Grateful Dead, the Rolling Stones, and many other rock musicians and concerts. Many other contributed in significant ways to American society.
So the Czech Kindertransport, it was also called the Winton train because of Nicholas Winton. He was the guy that started the Czech Kindertransport. There were already Kindertransports going on for like in Austria and Germany, but nothing had been done for the Czech children, and so he decided to do it. And he started when he was going to go on a ski vacation, but then one of his friends like called him and said, "Could you help me with all these Jewish refugees?" And he decided to go. And he was actually Jewish himself, and his parents had been German Jews, but he had been grown up in Britain his entire life. So he organized 8 transports, and throughout all of the Czech Kindertransport, there were 669 children saved, and maybe more, but that's all that are recorded. And these were mostly Czech Jews. The first transport was by plane, and there were 15 people on that plane, and it was through Sweden, and then from Prague to London. And then the next 7 were by train, and they went through Germany, then to the Atlantic coast, and then by boat across the channel, and then to London. And here is a map of their route. So they would go from Prague all the way until they got to London. So the first transport, the one by plane, was on March 14th, 1939, and that was the day before Germany occupied the Czech lands. And then the last one was on August 2nd, 1939. Then there was a third train that was supposed to leave on the 3rd of September, but then because of the war it was delayed. Actually, I mean, it wasn't able to leave, and so it never left the station, but and it would have been the largest transport yet with 250 children. And Winton said about it, none of the 250 children on board were seen again, so like the train just sort of disappeared afterwards. And we had 250 families waiting at Liverpool Street that day in vain. If the train had been a day earlier, it would have come through. Not a single one of those children was heard of again, which is an awful feeling. And so how he did it is when he started the kinder transport, he started in his hotel. Actually, he just set up an office, and then people would come up, line up, and sign up for their kids to be taken. And then he would go back to England, and there was some complications with like visas and all, but he would then, the main problem was just finding homes and raising money, because they all had to have money for the train there and back. And so he says the problem was getting people who would accept the children. It's marvelous that so many people did come forward. The unfortunate thing was that no other country would help. I tried America, but they didn't take any. And so this was just because he saw the other countries doing it, and he also, because of definitely the persecution. And one person that was saved by the kinder transports was Joe Schlesinger, I think. Mm-hmm. And so he was born in Austria, actually, but then raised in Czechoslovakia. And he and his brother went on the kinder transport, but his parents were killed during the war, and when he came back, so they found that they were dead. And then he wanted to become a journalist, and so, but in Czechoslovakia he couldn't because of, well, he was, but he decided to leave because of the communists, because they were starting to arrest journalists. And so, but he went to Canada, and so he became a journalist, and he is on CBC even today. And like, when I was typing in his name, there was some stuff like where an article he had written about Ukraine that was like one of the first things that popped up, so it's cool that he's still people like that. And another person that was from Czechoslovakia, he wasn't on the kinder transport, but one person that like I read about a lot was Thomas Bergenthal, I think. And his family was from, his mother was a German Jew, and his father was from Poland, and a Polish Jew, and he actually ended up going through, his parents were really amazing, and he was supposed to go to England on September 1st, 1939, but then because the war started, their train stopped, and so they ended up wandering out in the middle of nowhere. But his father died during the war, but he actually went to Auschwitz and to Sachsenhausen, but he survived all of this, and he was only like 9 or 10 at the time. So another organization that helped children during the war, and actually before, was Youth-Aliyah, and their motto was from survival to leadership. And the person who founded this was Richa Freyer, and she founded it on January 30th, 1933, which is the same day that Hitler came to power. And
so she sees the writing on the wall.
Hmm.
She's seeing the future. Mm. She's saying,
yes,
uh-oh, this is not good.
Yes, and she also was saying that, she was just saying how, like the quote says, it says, the utter senselessness of Jewish life in the diaspora stood palpably before my eyes. And so she just realized that we need to have our own nation, especially for all these children who are like defenseless. And another lady that worked with her was Henrietta Sold, and Freyer was in Germany and organizing Youth-Aliyah from Germany, and Sold was in Jerusalem and working with all the children there, because Youth-Aliyah was working to get the children from Germany to Palestine. And so she was in charge of also the Jewish Agency's social services and for basically all of Palestine. So at first when she heard about Youth-Aliyah, she was a little bit reluctant to do it because she wasn't sure that it was actually work and it would require a lot of commitment to bring it about. But when she saw how Freyr was really committed and where she saw that Freyr got some people out, and she also saw from like Nuremberg laws how the persecution was rising, she joined and became a supervisor. And so the children in Youth-Aliyah they were being trained to be like pioneers in Palestine. And so they would have some training in Germany first, and then they would go down to Palestine, and then they would be living in kibbutzim. And those were sort of like community homes, and they still have those today, like where they're like just like a community group, and where they're learning things like farming, and they learn Hebrew as well. And here's a picture of the first German children from Youth-Aliyah in the kibbutz Ein Harod, and they look very happy. And then also close to the beginning of the war, children, since it became harder to go down to Palestine, and Britain was starting to accept children from like the kinder transports, they also accepted some from Youth-Aliyah. And Youth-Aliyah saved around 22,000 children from before the war and during. And then Youth-Aliyah is actually still going on today. It like provides homes for children who are troubled, and also support and education, and it also, I think, helps with to like absorb children who are coming into the country. It said especially from like Russia and maybe Africa, I think. Yeah, and that's it.
Okay, so this is OSE. I'm not going to say it in French, but it means the rescue effort for children. Okay, so it was children and also refugees that were Jewish from other European nations. And what they did was they would connect them with other organizations and rescue them out of internment camps and helping them escape. And the OSCE helped them escape from 1940 to 1945. France they were located in France, and they were in the north part until 1940 when the Nazis invaded, and then it became an underground organization in Vichy, France. And they did it to help save the children whose parents had been murdered or separated from them. So one major rescuer was the International Children's Health Care and Welfare Society, which set up an underground children's rescue network known as the Circuit Garral. The children were schooled and trained according to their ages and given special training in physical education and survival skills to prepare them for possible dangers ahead. The OSCE gave assistance to children and adults in as many as 15 towns in France, and also from the internment camps in the southern France. Care was given to about 1,300 children, some orphans and some whose families had placed them in these facilities. As the Nazis approached in 1940, the homes were transferred to the unoccupied zone in Vichy, France, like I said. And after the Nazis moved into southern France, they went underground, but continued to hide children and transfer them to Switzerland when it was possible. So this is an important person who was part of the organization, André Salomon. In June to September 1941, he supervised 3 transports totaling to bring 350 children from the homes through Marseille and to the U.S. They were then sponsored by the U.S. Committee for the Care of European Children, or the Jewish Children's Aid, and assisted by the American Friends Service Committee in Marseille, the Quakers. They had also helped the German Jewish Children's Association. The Quakers were really active when they could be in helping to rescue the children. This is a really important case that I learned about. The Gurs internment camp was in Vichy, France, and during the camp started accepting various humanitarian organizations to use the facilities in 1940, and on February 15th, 1941, the OSC installed a medical post and obtained permission to take children away from the internment camp and would be housed in private homes in the rest of France. In October of 1940, this is really interesting, a Nazi governor from Germany was assigned to be the governor of this region of France called Alsace. And because Gurs was almost empty, they had deported all of the inhabitants, the governor decided that the 7,000 Jews from his hometown in Germany would be transported here to this internment camp in France. And living conditions were really bad, and within a year, 1,000 people died of typhus and other sicknesses and diseases. Of the survivors, some 700 managed to escape, and 2,000 obtained visas that let them emigrate. The rest, numbering several thousand, remained in the camp, and males in the best physical condition were imprisoned in French work gangs. And this is really interesting because this is pre-Wannsee conference where they decided about the extermination program and started to set up camps. And this was in France, and it was not like an official concentration camp, but it was holding these people, and it was like a foreshadowing of what was to come. And the decision to start the final solution didn't happen until 1942.
Yeah, Gers was at a book report by someone from Europe.
And they're almost ready, but one more thing about Germany is, this is not the Jewish children, but I was reading that German children who were evacuated from Germany in later times of the war, they were, a large group of them were sent to Denmark. And Denmark is, as we had heard before in my report, they were supposedly, they were receptive to Jews, and they were pro-Jew, but also they were supposedly very humane and accepting. But of course to German children it was different because they were from the hostile Germany, and that is Nazi Germany. And so actually thousands of these children who were German were put in internment camps, and they were mistreated really badly, and there were testimonies of things that had happened. And although they were Nazis and they were obviously mistreated because of their parents' decisions, there was a journalist who was writing about it. She was actually Jewish, and she was saying that this was a black spot on Denmark's history because they're supposed to have been, throughout all these years in the modern period, a very accepting and like a safe zone, kind of like Switzerland. So anyways, that's an interesting.
So there was an internment camp for German kids.
It was later in the war, but it was.
So
Yeah.
some people were evacuating Germany because of, even though they weren't Jews.
But of course, because now at the end of the war, it had turned and they were starting to get bombed themselves, and that's why they were sending away their children.
Okay, Aliyah Bet is a Hebrew term that references to the immigration of Jews to Palestine. The saying refers to the time between 1920 and 1948 when they were trying to get Jews to Palestine. That includes, I forget what year it's called, but there's a couple of organizations that that focus on children. This focused on children and adults, I think. It describes a movement of Jews, mainly many survivors of the Holocaust, around the 1940s, who were not permitted to enter British-controlled Palestine. So this was a much larger group trying to settle there, not necessarily children just being protected. It was referred by the British as illegal immigration. By 1948, over 100,000 Jews had taken the trip. 70,000 of those were Holocaust survivors, so especially after all they went through during the war, there was a huge influx of Holocaust survivors. This is the next one. Polish Council Aid for the Jews. It is also known as Zagoda. I think we got a handout on it.
Mm-hmm.
It was founded in September 27, 1942 by Zofia Korzak something. And
Frahelska Filipowics.
yeah, both were Catholic Poles. The organization contained Poles and Jews, from educated professionals to farmers. So it was a fairly diverse group. It wasn't just all Poles, like, oh, we need to help the Jews now. But it was a very large group. It was funded by the Polish underground government, so it was pretty big. It's estimated that half of the Jews saved during the Holocaust were aided in some way by the Zagoda. And I wasn't sure if this was all of them or just in Poland, but I think it was out of all the Jews saved.
Because they had the biggest rescue
Right.
effort.
They had the biggest rescue effort. Several members of the Zgoda Award awarded the title Righteous Among Nations by the Israeli government for hiding Jews during the war. The Zgoda helped almost 4,000 Polish Jews by providing food, medical care, shelter, and identity cards, so the Jews could go to the area inside of occupied Poland and not worry about being captured. Up to 9,000 Jewish children were smuggled out of the Warsaw Ghetto. 2,500 of these were cared for by the Children's Bureau, which was headed by Irina Sendler.
We know her name, don't we?
Right, I think she was like nominated for that big award.
Yeah, she was nominated for like the Nobel Peace Prize or something.
Nobel Peace
and then
Prize,
she
but, like-
lost it to someone who did something on global warming.
It's really ridiculous, but anyhow. This next group is Group Maurice Hakwad in
Niece,
Niece.
friend.
Nancy.
Question.
It was led by Maurice Kashud, and the organization contained about 25 to 30 women and all different backgrounds and religions, not just Jews. The group's purpose was to hide and provision Jews, and they even escorted some to Sweden by just taking groups and saying, oh, they're with us, and sending them off to Sweden through, forget where. In 1943, it was estimated the group provided over 20,000 identification cards and hundreds of other documents just so the Jews could get out of France and German occupied territory. They also hid 1,000 Jews in one city alone.
Would that be the city that was allowed to? Your city, right?
Yeah.
But I think the main function of the group was just to provide identification cards and just get them through, which I think was very effective. I mean, they didn't really have to hide the Jews as long as they gave them identification.
So all these groups kind of ended up touching each other a lot. One would, provide the visas, and the others,
Yeah.
the OSCE, the German Jewish Children's, and the Zgoda, obviously, they all kind of